The Dyatlov Pass incident, Russian, Romanized, Gibraltargrupi Dyatlova, lit. Death of the Dyatlov hiking group, was an event in which 9 Soviet ski hikers died in the northern Ural Mountains on 1 or February 2, 1959 under undetermined circumstances. The experienced trekking group from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, led by Igor Dyatlov, had established a camp on the eastern slopes of Kolit-Syakhl in the Russian SFSR of the Soviet Union. Overnight, something caused them to cut their way out of their tent and flee the campsite while inadequately dressed for the heavy snowfall and sub-zero temperatures. After the group's bodies were discovered, an investigation by Soviet authorities determined that 6 of them had died from hypothermia while the other 3 had been killed by physical trauma. 1 victim had major skull damage, 2 had severe chest trauma, and another had a small crack in his skull. 4 of the bodies were found lying in running water in a creek, and 3 of the 4 had damaged soft tissue of the head and face. 2 of the bodies had missing eyes, 1 had a missing tongue, and 1 had missing eyebrows. The investigation concluded that a compelling natural force had caused the deaths. Numerous theories have been put forward to account for the unexplained deaths, including animal attacks, hypothermia, and avalanche, katabatic winds, infrasound-induced panic, military involvement, or some combination of these factors. Russia reopened an investigation into the incident in 2019, concluding in 2020 that an avalanche had most likely forced survivors to suddenly leave their camp in low-visibility conditions with inadequate clothing before ultimately dying of hypothermia. Andrei Kuryakov, deputy head of the regional prosecutor's office, stated that it was a heroic struggle, there was no panic, but they had no chance to save themselves under the circumstances. On top of the tent, a flashlight also was left turned on, maybe intentionally so the hikers could find their way back to the tent once the winds subsided. The expedition proposed that the group of hikers constructed 2 bivouac shelters, one of which collapsed, leaving 4 of the hikers buried with the severe injuries observed. Another hypothesis popularized by Donny Icar's 2013 book Dead Mountain is that wind going around Kolit-Syakhl created a KRMN vortex street, which can produce infrasound capable of inducing panic attacks in humans. According to Icar's theory, the infrasound generated by the wind as it passed over the top of the Halachal mountain was responsible for causing physical discomfort and mental distress in the hikers. Icar claims that, because of their panic, the hikers were driven to leave the tent by whatever means necessary and fled down the slope. By the time they were farther down the hill, they would have been out of the infrasound's path and would have regained their composure, but in the darkness would have been unable to return to their shelter. The traumatic injuries suffered by 3 of the victims were the result of their stumbling over the edge of a ravine in the darkness and landing on rocks at the bottom. In one speculation, the campsite fell within the path of a Soviet parachute mine. This theory alleges that the hikers, woken by loud explosions, fled the tent in a shoeless panic and found themselves unable to return for supply retrieval. After some members froze to death attempting to endure the bombardment, others commandeered their clothing only to be fatally injured by subsequent parachute mine concussions. There are indeed records of parachute mines being tested by the Soviet military in the area about the time the hikers were there. A study led by scientists from EPFL and ETH Zurich, published in 2021, suggested that a type of avalanche known as a slab avalanche could explain some of the injuries. Parachute mines detonate while still in the air rather than upon striking the Earth's surface and produce signature injuries similar to those experienced by the hikers. Heavy internal damage with relatively little external trauma. The theory coincides with reported sightings of glowing, orange orbs floating or falling in the sky within the general vicinity of the hikers and allegedly photographed by them, potentially military aircraft or descending parachute mines. This theory, among others, uses scavenging animals to explain Dubinina's injuries. Some speculate that the bodies were unnaturally manipulated, on the basis of characteristic liver mortis markings discovered during an autopsy, as well as burns to hair and skin. Photographs of the tent allegedly show it was erected incorrectly, something the experienced hikers were unlikely to have done. A similar theory alleges the testing of radiological weapons and is based partly on the discovery of radioactivity on some of the clothing as well as the descriptions of the bodies by relatives as having orange skin and gray hair. However, radioactive dispersal would have affected all, not only some, of the hikers and equipment, and the skin and hair discoloration can be explained by a natural process of mummification after 3 months of exposure to the cold and wind. The initial suppression by Soviet authorities of files describing the group's disappearance sometimes is mentioned as evidence of a cover-up, but the concealment of information about domestic incidents was standard procedure in the USSR and thus far from peculiar. By the late 1980s, all Dyatlov files had been released in some manner. International Science Times posited that the hikers' deaths were caused by hypothermia, which can induce a behavior known as paradoxical undressing, in which hypothermic subjects remove their clothes in response to perceived feelings of burning warmth. A mountain pass in the area later was named Dyatlov Pass in memory of the group, despite the incident occurring about 1,700 meters, 5,600 feet, away on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. It is undisputed that 6 of the 9 hikers died of hypothermia. However, others in the group appear to have acquired additional clothing from those who had already died, which suggests that they were of a sound enough mind to try to add layers. Keith McCloskey, who has researched the incident for many years and has appeared in several TV documentaries on the subject, traveled to the Dyatlov Pass in 2015 with Yuri Kuntsevich of the Dyatlov Foundation and a group. At the Dyatlov Pass, he noted. McCloskey also noted Donnie Ikar, who investigated and made a documentary about the incident, evaluated several other theories that are deemed unlikely or have been discredited. A prominent rock outcrop in the area now serves as a memorial to the group. It is about 500 meters, 1,600 feet, to the east-southeast of the actual site of the final camp. In 1959, a group was formed for a skiing expedition across the northern Urals in Sverdlovsk Oblast, Soviet Union. According to prosecutor Tempelov, documents found in the tent of the expedition suggest the expedition was named for the 21st Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and possibly was dispatched by the local Komsomol organization. Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute, now Ural Federal University. The leader assembled a group of 9 others for the trip, most of whom were fellow students and peers at the university. The initial group consisted of 8 men and 2 women, but 1 member later returned because of health issues. Each member of the group was an experienced Grade 2 hiker with ski tour experience and would be receiving Grade 3 certification upon their return. At the time, Grade 3 was the highest certification available in the Soviet Union and required candidates to traverse 300 kilometers, 190 miles. The route was designed by Dyatlov's group to reach the far northern regions of the Sverdlovsk Oblast and the upper streams of the Lazva River. The Sverdlovsk City Route Commission approved the route. This was a division of the Sverdlovsk Committee of Physical Culture and Sport, and they confirmed the group of 10 people January 8, 1959. The goal of the expedition was to reach Otorten, a mountain 10 kilometers, 6.2 miles, north of the site where the incident occurred. This route, estimated as Category 3, was undertaken in February, the most difficult time to traverse. On January 23, 1959, the Dyatlov group was issued their route book, which listed their course following the number 5 trail. At that time, the Sverdlovsk City Committee of Physical Culture and Sport listed approval for 11 people. The 11th person listed was Semyon Zolotaryov, who had been certified to go with another expedition of similar difficulty, the Sogrin Expedition Group. The Dyatlov group left Sverdlovsk City, today Ekaterinburg. On the same day they received the route book. The group arrived by train at Ivdel, a town at the center of the northern province of Sverdlovsk Oblast, in the early morning of January 25, 1959. They then took a truck to Vizhai, a Lori village that is the last inhabited settlement to the north. On January 27, they began their trek toward Gorao Torten. On January 28, one member, Yuri Yudin, who had several health ailments, including rheumatism and a congenital heart defect, turned back because of knee and joint pain that made him unable to continue the hike. The remaining 9 hikers continued the trek. Diaries and cameras found around their last campsite made it possible to track the group's route up to the day preceding the incident. On January 31st, the group arrived at the edge of a highland area and began to prepare for climbing in a wooded valley. They cached surplus food and equipment that would be used for the trip back. The next day, the hikers started to move through the pass. It seems they planned to get over the pass and make camp for the next night on the opposite side. But because of worsening weather conditions, snowstorms, and decreasing visibility, they lost their direction and deviated west, toward the top of Kholat Syakhl. When they realized their mistake, the group decided to set up camp there on the slope of the mountain. Rather than move 15 kilometers, 0.93 miles, downhill to a forested area that would have offered some shelter from the weather. Yudin speculated, Dyatlov probably did not want to lose the altitude they had gained, or he decided to practice camping on the mountain slope. Before leaving, Dyatlov had agreed he would send a telegram to their sports club as soon as the group returned to Vizhai. It was expected this would happen no later than February 12th, but Dyatlov had told Yudin before he departed from the group. He expected it to be longer when the 12th passed and no messages had been received. There was no immediate reaction. Delays of a few days were common with such expeditions. On February 20th. The travelers' relatives demanded a rescue operation, and the head of the institute sent the first rescue groups, consisting of volunteer students and teachers. Later, the army and militia, police, forces became involved, with planes and helicopters ordered to join the operation. On February 26th. The searchers found the group's abandoned and badly damaged tent on Kolotsyakal. The campsite baffled the search party. Mikhail Sherovin, the student who found the tent, said, the tent was half torn down and covered with snow. It was empty, and all the group's belongings and shoes had been left behind. Investigators said the tent had been cut open from inside. 9 sets of footprints, left by people wearing only socks or a single shoe or even barefoot, could be followed, leading down to the edge of a nearby wood, on the opposite side of the pass, 15 kilometers, 0.93 miles, to the northeast. After 500 meters, 1,600 feet, these tracks were covered with snow at the forest's edge. Under a large Siberian pine, the searchers found the visible remains of a small fire. There were the first 2 bodies, those of Krivonashenko and Doroshenko, shoeless and dressed only in underwear. The branches on the tree were broken up to 5 meters high, suggesting that one of the hikers had climbed up to look for something, perhaps the camp. Between the pine and the camp, the searchers found 3 more corpses: Dyatlov, Kalmogorova, and Slobodin, who died in poses suggesting they were attempting to return to the tent. They were found at distances of 300, 480, and 630 meters, 980, 1,570, and 2,070 feet. From the tree, finding the remaining 4 travelers took more than 2 months. They finally were found May 4th under 4 meters, 13 feet of snow in a ravine 75 meters, 246 feet, further into the woods from the pine tree. 3 of the 4 were better dressed than the others, and there were signs that some clothing of those who had died first had been removed for use by the others. Dubinina was wearing Krivonashenko's burned, torn trousers, and her left foot and shin were wrapped in a torn jacket. A legal inquest started immediately after the first 5 bodies were found. A medical examination found no injuries that might have led to their deaths, and it was concluded that they had all died of hypothermia. Slobodin had a small crack in his skull, but it was not thought to be a fatal wound. An examination of the 4 bodies found in May shifted the narrative of the incident. 3 of the hikers had fatal injuries. Thibaut Brignoles had major skull damage, and Dubinina and Zolotaryov had major chest fractures. According to Boris Vozrozdeny, the force required to cause such damage would have been extremely high, comparable to that of a car crash. Notably, the bodies had no external wounds associated with the bone fractures, as if they had been subjected to a high level of pressure. All 4 bodies found at the bottom of the creek in a running stream of water had soft tissue damage to their head and face. For example, Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, part of the lips, as well as facial tissue and a fragment of skull bone, while Zolotaryov had his eyeballs missing, and Alexander Kolevatov his eyebrows. Vozrozdeny, the forensic expert performing the postmortem examination, judged that these injuries happened postmortem because of the location of the bodies in a stream. Initial speculation suggested that the indigenous Mansi people, reindeer herders in the area, had attacked and killed the group for encroaching upon their lands. Several Mansi were interrogated, but the investigation indicated that the nature of the deaths did not support this hypothesis. Only the hikers' footprints were visible, and they showed no sign of hand-to-hand struggle. Although the temperature was low, about 25 to 30 C, 13 to 22 F, with a storm blowing, the dead were only partially dressed. Some had only 1 shoe, while others wore only socks. Journalists reporting on the available parts of the inquest files claim that it states, at the time, the official conclusion was that group members had died because of a compelling natural force. The inquest officially ceased in May 1959 as a result of the absence of a guilty party. The files were sent to a secret archive. In 1997, it was revealed that the negatives from Krivonischenko's camera were kept in the private archive of one of the investigators. Lev Nikitic Ivanov. The film material was donated by Ivanov's daughter to the Dyatlov Foundation. The diaries of the hiking party fell into Russia's public domain in 2009. In February 2019, Russian authorities reopened the investigation into the incident, although only 3 possible explanations were being considered: an avalanche, a slab avalanche, or a hurricane. The possibility of a murder had been discounted. Anatoly Gushchin summarized his research in the book The Price of State Secrets is 9 Lives, Sverdlovsk, 1990. Some researchers criticized the work for its concentration on the speculative theory of a Soviet secret weapon experiment, but its publication led to public discussion, stimulated by interest in the paranormal. Indeed, many of those who had remained silent for 30 years reported new facts about the accident. One of them was the former police officer, Lev Nikitic Ivanov, who led the official inquest in 1959. In 1990, he published an article that included his admission that the investigation team had no rational explanation for the incident. He also stated that, after his team reported that they had seen flying spheres, he then received direct orders from high-ranking regional officials to dismiss this claim. In 2000, a regional television company produced the documentary film The Mystery of Dyatlov Pass. With the help of the film crew, a Ekaterinburg writer, Anna Matveyeva, published a docudrama novella of the same name. A large part of the book includes broad quotations from the official case, diaries of victims, interviews with searchers, and other documentaries collected by the filmmakers. The narrative line of the book details the everyday life and thoughts of a modern woman, an alter ego of the author herself, who attempts to resolve the case. Despite its fictional narrative, Matveyeva's book remains the largest source of documentary materials ever made available to the public regarding the incident. Also, the pages of the case files and other documentaries, in photocopies and transcripts, are gradually being published on a web forum for enthusiastic researchers. The Dyatlov Foundation was founded in 1999 at Ekaterinburg, with the help of Ural State Technical University, led by Yuri Kuntsevich. The foundation's stated aim is to continue investigation of the case and to maintain the Dyatlov Museum to preserve the memory of the dead hikers. On July 1, 2016, a memorial plaque was inaugurated in Solikamsk in Urals Perm region, dedicated to Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor of the expedition group, who died in 2013. On July 11, 2020, Andrei Kuryakov, deputy head of the Urals Federal District Directorate of the Prosecutor General's Office, announced an avalanche as the official cause of death for the Dyatlov group in 1959. Later, independent computer simulation and analysis by Swiss researchers also suggest avalanche as the cause. Summarizing Kuryakov's report in The New Yorker, Douglas Preston writes, "The most appealing aspect of Kuryakov's scenario is that the Dyatlov party's actions no longer seem irrational. The snow slab, according to Green, probably would have made loud cracks and rumbles as it fell across the tent, making an avalanche seem imminent." Kuryakov noted that although the skiers made an error in the placement of their tent, everything they did subsequently was textbook. They conducted an emergency evacuation to ground that would be safe from an avalanche. They took shelter in the woods, they started a fire, they dug a snow cave. Had they been less experienced, they might have remained near the tent, dug it out and survived, but avalanches are by far the biggest risk in the mountains in winter. The more experience you have, the more you fear them. The skiers' expertise doomed them. Reviewing a sensationalist Yeti hypothesis, American skeptic author Benjamin Radford suggests an avalanche as more plausible. That the group woke up in a panic and cut their way out the tent, either because an avalanche had covered the entrance to their tent or because they were scared that an avalanche was imminent. Better to have a potentially reparable slit in a tent than risk being buried alive in it under tons of snow. They were poorly clothed because they had been sleeping, and ran to the safety of the nearby woods where trees would help slow oncoming snow. In the darkness of night, they got separated into 2 or 3 groups. One group made a fire, hence the burned hands, while the others tried to return to the tent to recover their clothing given that the danger had passed. But it was too cold, and they all froze to death before they could find their tent in the darkness. At some point, some of the clothes might have been recovered or swapped from the dead, But at any rate, the group of 4 whose bodies was most severely damaged were caught in an avalanche and buried under 4 meters (13 feet) of snow, more than enough to account for the compelling natural force the medical examiner described. Dubinina's tongue probably was removed by scavengers and ordinary predation. Arguments against an actual avalanche, and not the fear of an avalanche, include a review of the 1959 investigation's evidence completed 2015 to 2019 by experienced investigators from the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation, ICRF, on request of the families confirmed the avalanche with several important details added. First of all, the ICRF investigators, one of them an experienced alpinist, confirmed that the weather on the night of the tragedy was harsh, with wind speeds up to hurricane force, 2,030 meters per second, 4,567 miles per hour, 72,108 kilometers per hour, a snowstorm and temperatures reaching 40 C, 40 F. These factors were not considered by the 1959 investigators, who arrived at the scene of the accident 3 weeks later, when the weather had much improved and any remains of the snowslide had settled and been covered with fresh snowfall. The harsh weather at the same time played a critical role in the events of the tragic night, which have been reconstructed as follows. According to the ICRF investigators, the factors contributing to the tragedy were extremely bad weather and lack of experience of the group leader in such conditions, which led to the selection of a dangerous camping place. After the snowslide, another mistake of the group was to split up, rather than building a temporary camp down in the forest and trying to survive through the night. Negligence of the 1959 investigators contributed to their report, creating more questions than answers, as well as inspiring numerous alternative and conspiracy theories. In 2021, a team of physicists and engineers led by Alexander Puzrin and Johann Gaum published a new model in Communications Earth and Environment that demonstrates how even a relatively small slide of snow slab on the Kolotsykal slope could cause tent damage and injuries consistent with those suffered by the Dyatlov team. In 2019, a Swedish-Russian expedition was made to the site, and investigators ultimately proposed that a violent katabatic wind was a plausible explanation for the incident. Katabatic winds are somewhat rare events and can be extremely violent. They were implicated in a 1978 case at Anaris Mountain in Sweden, where 8 hikers were killed and 1 was severely injured. The topography of these locations was noted to be similar, according to the expedition. A sudden katabatic wind would have made it impossible to remain in the tent, and the most rational course of action would have been for the hikers to cover the tent with snow and seek shelter behind the tree line.